Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
And we are broadcasting from KWKY Mercy One, Iowa Catholic Radio Studios. We got a special treat for you today, friends. First of all, I want to say I'm Bo Bonner here in Des Moines, Iowa, Director of Mission and Ministry at Mercy College of Health Sciences and the Executive Vice President for the Newman Idea. You can visit both of those at mchs.edu and newmanidea.org. But out there in Pittsburgh, tell the good folks what you do.
Here in the city of Pitts, I'm the Director of the National Institute for Newman Studies, and you can find out about our mission and work at newmanstudies.org.
We want to thank the Mercy College of Health Sciences, who always underwrites our show, mchs.edu, like I said, getting ready to start in the spring semester, getting ready to start the summer one. And yes, we're on the go. You guys can go check out the classes. I know it's a crazy time, but particularly if you want to be a part of a field that's the front line of what we're dealing with the COVID-19 crisis, please check out mchs.edu. And if you have anybody you want to contact there, they are more than eager to hear from you and talk to you about the semesters in summer and fall that are coming up. Bud, we have a special show today for everyone. We had the wonderful privilege of not working only with Iowa Catholic Radio, but with the Diocese of Des Moines, particularly John Wynn, who runs the Faith Journey office over there. The Catholic Culture Series, of course, hit a bump like everybody else did because of the difficulties with not being able to gather. So we had a Zoom conference, a Zoom lecture series, so that you could be in Pittsburgh, but you and I could both speak. And so we were able to have this conference together, and it was like getting the gang back together.
Yeah, the country as a whole is adjusting to this new reality, hopefully a temporary reality here. But the upside of it all was that we ended up going back to the topic of the resurrection because it's Eastertide, and this part of our Christian faith is on everyone's mind. But I think it ended up being of course I'm biased, but it ended up being like a really good talk. I think during this tough time at this stage in history, to go back to the promises and the hope that we have rooted in Christ's resurrection was really worthwhile.
So this was recorded live on April 25th. Like I said, it had Zoom. So there might be references sometimes of Bud and I talking about what we looked like, or if we were making hand motions. I think Bud looked like a newscaster commenting on the NBA finals. Right. Because he had headphones. So it was pretty cool. But yes, this was recorded April 25th. We took the two main sections out of the talk. Bud primarily talking about the resurrection, myself talking about the life we live after the resurrection. The whole thing's called The Resurrection of the Life. And one more time, we want to thank not only Iowa Catholic Radio, but the Diocese of Des Moines doing this joint venture. And so we're going to share Bud and I's 2 20-minute talks with you today that we got to share back, like I said, just a couple weeks ago. So thank you for everybody who made this possible. Again, another hat tip towards John Wynn and the bishop for letting us do something like this. Bud and I haven't got to have a talk together for a while, so it was really great to be on the lecture circuit again together, even if it was quote unquote virtual. So without further ado, stick around, The Uncommon Good. We are going to play our Resurrection and the Life lecture series for all of you here on the radio today. This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back right after this. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this Wednesday. Thank you for listening to the show. As we said at the top of the hour, this is a special treat for us. Bud and I had the wonderful privilege of working together with Iowa Catholic Radio and the Diocese of Des Moines to give a virtual lecture on the resurrection and the life for the local Catholic Culture Lecture Series. So this is back on April 25th. And in league with the diocese, we were going to play 2 of the segments. The main segments of Bud and I each giving a talk. Bud, you're up first. Is there anything we need to let people know or warn them about?
Yeah, just as a brief sneak preview, I start with the reality of Christ's resurrection and deal with a couple challenges that have been raised to that question. But that's really just a springboard to think about what does it mean to be a community as the church that lives out the reality of the resurrection. So that's what I really try to get to in the bulk of the conversation.
Well, it's a great talk. I'm glad you got to go first. It set up the rest of the conversations, including mine, well. So everybody sit back and relax and get ready for Bud Marr talking about the resurrection of the life. This is the April 25th lecture that we got to give in unison with Iowa Catholic Radio and the Diocese of Des Moines Catholic Lecture Series. Let's roll that beautiful bean footage.
Our topic is the resurrection. And for me, the resurrection is the heart of the Christian faith.
Here it says Bud and Arlene Staley flashing.
The resurrection is the heart of the Christian faith, but also in many ways the most difficult part of the faith, maybe sometimes for people to receive and understand. This really comes home to you, I think, if you've ever lost a loved one. And I can remember several years back being at my own grandmother's funeral and, seeing this woman I loved so dearly and, thinking of the confession that Christians make that we could be reunited again. And on one level, that was a source of great consolation, but it also, seeing the body that we're about to bury in the ground and thinking about that person being raised, not simply spiritually, but bodily at a future day. It's no wonder that this has been scandalous for many non-Christians and unbelievers. So throughout time and up to our own day, you've seen folks try to explain the resurrection away. For atheists and hardcore skeptics, the idea that a person could be raised again just cuts against the grain of what they say, everything that we know on the basis of science. This would just break the uniform laws that guide the universe. And unfortunately, in the face sometimes of those challenges, you've seen Christian theologians and Christian thinkers maybe try to cut a middle ground and to answer the challenges of skeptics by maybe explaining away the scandal. I could point to a number of figures I recently came across by a book by the late Marcus Borg. And Borg makes the case in that book. He says the focus for him is not so much the question of whether Jesus was raised again, whether the tomb was empty. But he says for him, the significance of the New Testament and what the apostles teach is he says their post-Easter Jesus experience. So let me read just a passage from Borg's book, The Meaning of Jesus. Whether Easter involved something remarkable happening to the body of Jesus is irrelevant. I see the post-Easter Jesus as an experiential reality. Christians throughout the centuries have continued to experience Jesus as a living figure, presence in their midst, not simply a memory from the past. Those experiences then and now have taken a variety of forms. They include visions, mystical experiences, prayer, and even worship. But the truth of Easter is grounded in these experiences, Borg writes, not in what happened or didn't happen on a particular Sunday almost 2,000 years ago. Thus Marcus Borg. Now, on the surface, that might all sound fine and dandy. I think, for someone like Borg, the idea is that you get your cake and eat it too. You have the significance of the momentous teachings that Jesus gave us and the example that he passed on to his followers. But you no longer have to answer, again, like I'm mentioning, the criticisms of skeptics and others who say it's just not possible that a person could be born again. The problem with this approach, of course, as you probably know, is that it's completely out of sync with the New Testament vision and what the apostles, both the 12 disciples and St. Paul, passed down to us. So I think specifically of a passage like 1 Corinthians 15, where St. Paul says, if the dead are not raised, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, then our faith is futile. Among all people, Christians are the most to be pitied. An answer to figures like Borg and picking up on the themes that St. Paul writes about in his own letters, there have been biblical scholars like the renowned scholar N.T. Wright, who have said that if you really read the New Testament witness against the backdrop of first century Judaism, you see that the most plausible explanation of what's been given to us in the Bible is that Jesus was truly bodily raised, that he appeared to his disciples, and that this changed dramatically their understanding of what God was doing in their midst. You see, the problem with the perspective of those like Borg who want to say that Jesus' appearance to them was merely a sort of like spiritual experience or a mystical presence, is that Judaism had ways of expressing just those sorts of ideas. So we see in the Old Testament, for instance, accounts of ghosts. And the disciples could have easily gone that sort of route if this was simply a spiritual presence. On the other hand, there were other Jews, for instance, the Pharisees, who confessed a general resurrection of the dead, where at the end of time, the just would be raised. But the disciples are saying and doing something completely different. And I think the key, and N.T. Wright really picks up on this, is the dramatic difference that we see between how the disciples act and live when Christ is arrested and then executed. So all of them, save one, flee and scatter. And then just a few days later, and in the weeks and the months to come, how differently they conducted themselves. You see, I think Wright is completely correct that the most plausible explanation for that shift was precisely that the disciples believed that their Lord had been raised. Kind of like to point this out, we can set this against the backdrop of other messiahs. So around this time, in the early 2nd century, you have a figure like Bar Kokhba, a Jewish messiah. And many of his followers, when Bar Kokhba led this revolt against Rome, they said the Messiah has come. And we even have archaeological evidence of coins that were minted that, had Bar Kokhba on them and said year 1, of these messianic events. But when Bar Kokhba was executed by the Romans, when the revolt was put down and suppressed and he was executed, the messianic claims immediately died out. You see, for the Jews, a crucified Messiah was no Messiah at all. But with Jesus, something completely different takes place. After he's killed, the messianic claims that his followers were making don't go away. They're actually intensified. And the apostles are no longer fearful. They're willing to go to their deaths, to painful deaths, saying, Jesus is Lord. And I think in our own time, we have to realize just how political of a statement that was, that the Romans and other Jews knew exactly what the followers of Jesus were claiming. They were staking, this claim to another kingdom, even if it was slightly different than what they at first were expecting, and certainly what their brothers in the Jewish faith were expecting. So the first thing I think that we have to toss out the window is any sort of explanation of Jesus' resurrection that goes in a direction that's not affirming completely an empty tomb and his bodily presence among his disciples. Now, that being said, I want to throw one other thing out there, and we can come back to this a little bit later. But Pope Benedict XVI, in his book on eschatology, he makes the point that Jesus' resurrected body, and this is essential, was not simply a resuscitated body. So Jesus had performed miracles where he had raised Lazarus from the dead, and he raised others from the dead, I believe the son of a widow. And in those cases, the person was raised again, but was still destined to die. With Christ, we have something completely different. There's a continuity between his earthly body, but also something very different is taking place. He appears to be able to, pass through doors. He's not bound by space and time any longer in the same way that our earthly bodies are. And that will be significant later on as we talk about some of the implications of the resurrection. So that's kind of the foundation of Christian belief. But in the remainder of my time, I want to unpack what that means for us today. So we believe that Christ is raised again. That's the heart of the Christian message. What should that mean for our lives together as Christians? There are many different implications that we could look at this evening. For the sake of time, I'm going to focus on 3. And then I'll turn the mic over to Bo here. So what does it mean that Christians worship a risen Lord? I want to say it means 3 things. And the first of these is that we are an evangelistic community. We're a community that proclaims the resurrection. Now, on the surface, that seems maybe obvious and simplistic, but I think it's something important to stress in our own day and time. Because we've seen around us, I think, many well-meaning followers of Jesus who sometimes, in certain cases, reduce the Christian faith merely to a matter of serving the poor, feeding the hungry and clothing the naked. And obviously that's so vital to our faith. Our Lord even says that at the last day, we'll be judged, of course, for what we do to the least of these. But if we go about those tasks without proclaiming Christ crucified and Christ risen again, I fear that we risk the church becoming simply an NGO or a charitable institution, and frankly, not a very efficient one at that. What you see with the disciples is when Christ comes to them and after his death and his resurrection, that the first thing that they do, in the book of Acts, we see Peter and Paul and the apostles doing all sorts of things. It says that the early Christians shared their goods in common and that, the disciples performed these healings. But the first thing that they do is that they proclaim Christ risen again. And that has to be a part of our DNA. If we're going to be a community gathered around Christ's body, the proclamation that we have as we go about our vocations is really the foundation of all that we're about as Christians. So first off, we're an evangelistic or a charismatic community. The second thing I would say is that we're a bodily community. So just as Jesus' presence after the resurrection was not merely spiritual, we saw that already, so should be the case of our witness as the body of Christ. And I use that term intentionally. The most common term for the church in the New Testament is that we're the body of Christ. And a body is visible and it's tangible. It's something that folks can grab a hold of. I would contrast this part of who we are as Christians with what I would call ejection pod Christianity, or maybe rapture theology. Sometimes you'll hear preachers talk in such a way that kind of the goal of the Christian faith is, like the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and the task that lies before us is simply just to hunker down until God whisk us out of here to a safer place. That vision is just not consonant with the New Testament at all. In the New Testament, we see that the people of God form a new community, a visible body, and it's one that's it's a preview of the kingdom that God is bringing into the world. And this is so essential as baptized believers. It's not simply that our souls are saved, but the whole person is saved, body and soul. We baptize bodies, we anoint bodies, we bury bodies. So it's not as if the state has a say over a body and then the church is simply concerned about the soul. No, we're called to make visible in the world the kingdom that we preach. So we're called to be an evangelistic community. We're called to be a bodily community. And finally, we're called to be a reconciling community. So I've already briefly mentioned that Jesus' resurrected body bore certain similarities to his body before his death, but in other ways that it was different. We say that it was a glorified body. But one characteristic of our Lord's risen body that has always captured my imagination, and frankly, in some eras, puzzled theologians, is the fact that Jesus, after his resurrection, still bears the marks of his crucifixion. He still bears the wounds of his execution in his body. And the reason this is somewhat surprising is, of course, as Christians, our hope is that when we're raised to glory, that maybe some of the deformities that we have now, whether that's, for those who are paralyzed or deaf or blind, that we will be freed from those melodies, and the glorified experience of the risen in Christ will be something completely different. And yet our Lord still bears the marks of his crucifixion in his body. And I think there's something very significant about this. And this jumped out to me a few years back. If you'll stick with me for a few minutes, I was watching Saturday Night Live, and I saw a skit that I think brought this into sharp relief. Now, I want to caution you, I don't know if you should go find the skit on YouTube because it's sacrilegious in some ways, but I think by contrasting what the Bible shows us with what that skit showed really says something significant. And in this SNL skit, after Jesus dies and is risen again,
it depicts him as seeking revenge on his enemies. I think the host for the night was Quentin Tarantino, and they show like what appears to be a revenge flick with our Lord, going after the soldiers, for instance, who crucified him. And of course, the punchline, or the reason the audience is laughing, is that we know Jesus would never act in such a way, that after his resurrection, he went about something completely different altogether. And I think that's what the significance of him still burying his wounds in his body in part is about. That for the first time in history, you basically have an innocent victim who is killed, and instead of revenge taking place or the murder being covered up, a new community arises from that woeful death. Before the time of Jesus, most cultures around the world were built around exclusion and scapegoating. You think about like the Roman civilization, what set them apart? They said, we're Romans because we're superior to all those whom we've conquered. Or we see this in Mesoamerican cultures, where sometimes they would even capture members of other tribes and offer them as human sacrifices to placate the gods. And even the Jewish people, I mean, I want to be careful how I communicate this, but even for some of the Jewish religious leaders, the Torah, which was this great gift, became a means of exclusion. It became, some of the leaders interpreted it in such a way so that the emphasis was on Gentiles or Samaritans or the impure being left out. Jesus is the innocent victim who willingly goes to his own death, and he offers his life for the sins of the world. And when he's raised again, mysteriously, like I said, he still bears the wounds of his crucifixion in his body. But instead of seeking revenge, he offers those to those who betrayed him and who abandoned him. And he says, in effect, enter this new community, a community based not on revenge and exclusion, but on reconciliation and forgiveness. And so from that time forward, Christians are supposed to be those who are characterized by precisely those emphases, that they know themselves to be the forgiven, and they in turn offer that forgiveness and that mercy to others. So I guess in sort of wrapping up, I want us to today in this Easter season to think about, the real scandal and the power of that message. It's telling to me that some of the pagans who witnessed the first Christians, they accused them of being basically a secretive cult who thought they could gain eternal life by drinking the blood of their leader who had died. And in some ways, the Romans were right. They only got halfway there because they didn't have the eyes of faith. But the Christian community is a community that gathers around a sacrifice, the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And the source of our life is the body and blood of Christ, what St. Ignatius of Antioch calls the medicine of immortality. Except in this case, the sacrifice that is offered is not the willful murder of a victim with no say. It's the Son of God. And each Eucharist is a representation of Calvary. And each Sunday morning is an opportunity to receive that forgiveness and that grace again, so that our lives can be transformed and we can go forth from that place being an evangelistic community, a community that's baptizing others and saving them, body and soul, a whole person, but intrinsically and centrally a reconciling community that has a message of forgiveness that the world so desperately needs to hear. So for me, during these strange and turbulent times, I'm coming back to the message of Easter in a profound way. I feel like in some ways, this coronavirus situation that we're facing, that there's almost kind of a demonic element to it. It not only takes the lives of folks, but it also separates family members from each other, and in some ways has cut us off from the sacraments. But it's also a unique opportunity for the church to proclaim resurrection in a new and profound way, to be visible publicly, whether that's, priests hearing roadside confessions, or members of the church being on the front lines in hospitals or delivering food to the elderly. But in a time where I think death is facing so many Americans in a new and profound way, where previously we may have been able to push it and bracketed to the side, and now it's also and close and right in front of our faces. The church has the opportunity to proclaim that we're not hemmed in by birth on one side of our life and death on the other, but that our Lord has broken those bounds. And so our own life as a community, our own decision making doesn't have to be driven by a fear of death or by questions of scarcity of resources, but we can affirm and then live out and embody what our Lord taught, that unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground, it remains just one seed, but if it enters the ground and dies, it springs up to new and abundant life. Thank you.
Man, Bud, if I didn't know that that was you, I would have thought that was some sort of mystic sage that we happened to get a recording of to play on the radio.
No, I think I was very much the opening band this evening before the headliner. So
I don't think that's fair, but that's like when AC/DC opened for Led Zeppelin or something like that. Like it was a new day was dawning, and you remind me of AC/DC. You don't at all. I'm joking.
Okay, I'll accept that. I'll be the Gary Payton to your Sean Kemp, but you do slam dunk it home during your own piece.
I like that we started with old metal bands and then we ended with the Supersonics, which plenty of people on air do not even know about. So I approve of that.
We definitely aged ourselves with those
folks,
references.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
that's right.
We definitely aged ourselves with those references. Yeah,
I know. I'm very proud of us. I am. This is the Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. We'll be back with the second half of this lecture series right after these messages. With the Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this Wednesday. Thank you for listening to the show. As we did in the top half of the show, we've been listening to the lecture series that Bud and I got the chance to give in unison with Iowa Catholic Radio and the Diocese of Des Moines Catholic Lecture Series. We want to thank everyone at the studio, John Wynn and the Bishop, for allowing us to do that. The first 20 minutes, we got to hear from Bud, a wonderful talk talking about the resurrection and its importance for our daily life. So we called the lecture series The Ressurection and the Life. Bud talked about the resurrection. I decided to talk about the life and see how the ramifications of the resurrection sort of played out in history and in our time. Bud, is there anything you should caution people as an outsider about, my talk and how much it's going to surprise people?
No, in all seriousness, I thought it was a great talk. And for myself, when the evening wrapped up, I really thought, maybe a gauge for our faithfulness as the church is, do we have good, strong critics? Because I think if we're living the faith well, we'll necessarily bump up against the world. And I think your talk really captures that.
Well, I appreciate the kind words. Folks out there listening, that's for you to judge. Here we go with the next 20-minute segment from the Resurrection and Life lecture series that Bud and I got to do virtually on April 25th. And here we go. So our talk together, Bud and I, was the resurrection and the life. So that sort of means that Bud got the resurrection and I got the life. Now, of course, you can't separate these two. And hopefully what you see is that these are intertwined. So the question is, why double up on this? Why have two 20-minute talks? Part of this always has to do that by seeing things by multiple angles, we might be able to pick up resonances between the two in different ways. For any of us who've been Catholic for a long time, and I'm not acting like I've been Catholic for as long as many people, since 2006 for me, but you get to be Catholic long enough and you realize that by the end of it all, depending on how long you live, you might end up hearing some of these gospel stories hundreds of times in Mass alone. Not only do they become sort of the bedrock of our thoughts about the faith. So when it comes to talking about the life we are to live, now that we've been given life through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, there's always the opening question to ask, who are you, Bo, and why do you think you have anything to say about the life we're supposed to live? Luckily for you, I don't think I have anything new to say. If we were going to talk about the positive elements of the life of faith, there are certainly much better places to go look and better words to dwell on. Obviously, what comes to mind is the Beatitudes that we find in the Gospel, various things that we see in Acts and the letters, of course, in the New Testament. The Didache, which very early on is a sort of Christian summation of what life should look like following Christ, all the way up to our modern catechism, and then, of course, the resources that you would get at a place like the Diocese of Des Moines. Instead, I would like to give us a new perspective on what living life in conformity and imitation of Jesus Christ might look like by considering what the most immediate people who were not Christians, the first quote unquote enemies of the faith, thought of the life that the early Christians led. I got this inspiration from a book that I'm plagiarizing, but it's not plagiarism because I'm now telling you and showing you. This is now called quoting and getting an idea from it. The book is wonderful. Robert Louis Wilkins, The Christians as the Romans Saw Them. Wilkins has many such books that I could recommend to all of you. In fact, if you want to talk about the positive view of the thought and life of the early Christians, he has a magisterial work. I think it's called The Spirit of Early Christianity or Early Christian Thought. Forgive me for not. And then he has a new book out, which is just the first 1,000 years of Christianity. This is an earlier book of his, like I said, The Christians as the Romans Saw Them. And it is a fascinating book to hear the insults, the arguments, the calumnies, the way that the Romans, the first sort of huge group of pagans, as it were, who came to know the Christians and how they acted, what they thought of us. What were the central accusations of the Romans who interacted with the Christians? What did they think we did wrong? What did they think we were worth arresting for and killing for? And then, of course, to give away the ghost a little bit, do we live up to the insults that the earliest Romans threw our way? Or would the Romans kind of find us on their side of things, just situations a little different because whatever dominant religion in 2020 is? So that to keep in mind, do we live up to the insults that are thrown our way? So you can go through and, like I said, look at many of these people. Wilkin is a wonderful writer. The book comes to life. You feel like you're in mostly the 2nd and then 3rd centuries as you start to read what the Romans thought about us. One caveat, maybe not as sacrilegious as Saturday Night Live, or maybe more, who knows. Some of the things that they say about us are quite bracing. Some of them outright lies. Many of them misunderstandings that are sort of the incapacity of the Roman mind to quite understand the new things that Christians were saying, added on to sort of insults that they threw out to any kind of religion they didn't know about. A lot of class warfare. So the people who are writing are upper class Romans, and so they kind of think this is the religion of the poor and idiotic. But this all becomes this sort of interesting miasma, saying that Christians would run around and sacrifice babies. There's the craziest one, just to throw out to show you where you're at. They said Christians would cover babies in flour so that no one knew it was a baby. And then they would ask everyone to just smack the lump of flour as hard as possible. And then in the end, reveal that it was a baby that they killed. And then they drank the blood of the baby and had an orgy. People have crazy imaginations. We're almost dead sure nothing like this happened, although there are Gnostic Christians who did crazy stuff, so you never know. But you start to see that in the Roman mind, because Christians were considered relatively secretive, and again, this may be overblown because Christians started to see the function of religion different than most Romans and other pagans, your imagination ran wild about what we were up to and what our problem was. The first sort of proof we have in the books, so not hearsay, is from Pliny, who started, we have letters that he wrote to the Emperor Trajan about what he was supposed to do in his role as an officer of the Roman Empire. And so he gets somewhere and there becomes the problem of what do we do about all these people complaining about Christians in town? So we were enough of troublemakers that people were ratting us out, hoping that the local government, like provincial, when he came to town, would do something about it. And so Pliny's trying to sort of talk about what he thinks the Christians are. And the first sort of definition he comes up to is the Greek hateria, and I'm probably saying this wrong, but forgive me, all you Greek speakers. But the word is roughly a club or a society. That can make it sound like what he's saying is sort of writing us off as something similar, like we're simple, like we're a bowling league. But to be fair, what you see in the Roman Empire leading up to that time and period is these clubs could be anything from a firefighters guild to sort of foreign people in the Roman Empire who wanted to keep, their worship of Isis, goddess in Egypt, alive, or something like this. What's worth remarking is at the time when Pliny is asking Trajan what he should do, there was a universal ban on these clubs. The idea was not that the clubs were political in and of themselves, but being that they were a way to get groups together, have food, have a religious element, and then kvetch about things, that they caused divisiveness. And so that this divisiveness in the empire by that time was worrisome enough. There was enough divisiveness with the people at the top constantly killing each other in civil war, that they decided that the plebes didn't need any help causing agitation in the empire. So they uniformly suppressed these, whether they did it in all instances or not, that's for people to argue. But unlike the Christians who used the Greek word ecclesia, which meant political assembly, the Romans never thought that we were worthy of such a title. We were a club, and our biggest problem was our divisiveness. Because we were a club that was not only this sort of political unit, social unit that could get political and therefore worrisome, but a foreign one that didn't make sense in the Roman Empire. Pliny straight up decided that if anybody admitted to being a Christian, he killed them on the spot. So just to reel this in to show you that just being called one of these clubs was no small potatoes. It was considered offensive and obstinate to go up to a Roman official and admit to belonging to one of these clubs. There was this sort of idea that you should at least have the good graces to lie once or twice. And Pliny even says this to the emperor, like, well, I asked them if they're a Christian, and then I asked them again, and then I asked them a third time. So there's sort of this Roman civic idea that if you were a decent person who would obey the Roman officials, you lie the first 2 times, then you admit it, and then maybe there could be a plea bargain. The people who admitted out of the gate were killed on the spot. A lot of people said, well, I was a Christian, but then, I got a new girlfriend, or like that was 20 years ago, things like this. And so Pliny was literally asking the emperor what he should do about these sort of middling people. But this idea that we were a club that was worrisome enough to be divisive to the empire, that's one of the things that we were first called, and I want you to think in the back of your head. The way that you practice the faith, are you divisive enough to be thrown into any jail or to be killed over your devotion to the Christian faith? Now, I'm not trying to say that there's any sort of specific thing or call to action that I'm asking here, but think about with the earliest Christians being called a club worrisome enough to ask the emperor what even the people who've gone away from it. Do we live in any sort of way that would mark us off dangerous enough for an emperor to even care? The next thing we see Christians uniformly start to be called is a superstition. So Tacitus will do this, for instance, in one of his famous descriptions of when he's talking about the Roman Empire. We think of the word superstition as, people who believes in myth, or even sort of a childish understanding of things, or, that flies in the face of settled science. Superstition for us has a lot of overarching elements about whether you are justified in believing what you do. But for the Romans, superstitio had a very particular understanding, and the idea was this was a cult foreign to the Roman makeup of society. Particularly, what they accused Christians of is first, atheism, because they didn't believe in the Roman gods. And not that they didn't misunderstand and go, oh, they don't have a God, they have this Jesus person. No, they would say that the Christians were atheistic because they only had one God and they excluded all others, and therefore should be considered as atheists. But the next thing they accused us of was impiety. Now, this starts to be interesting because piety and pietism in the modern world is considered sort of a hallmark of a certain type of Christianity, and is largely poo-pooed upon as sort of this caring a little bit too much about the niceties of religion, keeping your nose clean, acting like you're better than everyone else. What's funny is the Romans said it was Christian arrogance that made them impious. For instance, one thing they almost uniformly point out is what they call the arrogance of the martyrs, that they would willingly go up and defy the emperor or the governor to his face, and then willingly march off and die, loudly proclaiming that they would rather die than worship any Roman god, or even just sort of let bygones be bygones. The idea that you couldn't stand Roman pluralism, and for that, we don't have enough time to go into it, but it's not even like the pluralism today, but the idea that there could be a pantheon of gods and maybe you just have a different idea. No, you would march off and go get killed. It was considered a sort of impious arrogance. Now, what do we mean by that piety? One of the things that's interesting about the Romans is I think sometimes we get the idea that they themselves weren't religious. There's a certain understanding of the Christian story where Rome was just basically a paper tiger begging for its religion to be thrown to the ground, because paganism was simply just a construct that no one really believed in, or only the actual superstitious, what we mean by superstitious, believed in it, and no one really did. But it's simply not the case. The Romans had a very strong understanding of religion. In fact, a lot of their apologies about themselves is that they were a uniquely religious people. They simply didn't mean it like most of us do in the modern day. You take the Latin re and ligare, which was what makes religion, and that word ligare, where we get the word for ligament in our bones. The idea is the thing that bounds something together. And certainly the Christians believed that it was Christ and his resurrected body, like Bud said, that bound this new ecclesia together. But for the Romans, this didn't really set well with the idea that what bounded people together was the social religious observance that people did in a sort of public civic way. So the idea was an emphasis on the social, the utilitous, and the piety as sort of a long-lasting belief and understanding that what our fathers did binds us as well, and that this sort of paternity broadcasted into the future would be what would tie all other sort of religious and civic impulses together. The Roman Empire extended like it did because of the piety of its civilians, of its citizens, and the Christians were considered uncivic. The martyrs were arrogant and presumptuous. They stood apart. They refused military service. They were iffy about taxes. They didn't go and do public sacrifices. They believed in the exclusivity of their God and their Jesus Christ. And what basically starts to happen is the Romans say this is a superstition, because anybody who has a religion worth its salt would emphasize piety overall, the long-standing social fabric of the religion. And this people who not only didn't have a land of their own, but cut across many social groups and economic classes, threw a wrench in that. So superstition was about impiety. So you start to see clubs. Are we worrisome enough as a people now in 2020 that people go, maybe we should suppress this club, this group, this society? And then do we act distinct enough from everybody else for people to accuse us of superstition? Do we seem like certain aspects? Are we uncivic enough, for instance, not to participate in what society now thinks is very important, but we don't? Would we ever feel comfortable, for instance, not participating in like Black Friday or something like this, some economic event that, of course, is very important to society that we don't? Would we ever set ourselves apart like the Christians did? Finally, by the late 2nd century, you get Galen, who was a philosopher and a physician. He's very famous for being sort of one of the people that a lot of the medieval understandings of physiology is based off of. But Galen does us a favor. He doesn't really talk about Christianity as a superstition or one of these clubs. He talks about it as a philosophy, but he doesn't talk about it in philosophy as a terms of thought. Philosophy for the 2nd century was synonymous with a way of life. So this is where I get this idea, the life, right? The life we live. And that the schools of philosophy were based on their founders, right? So Plato and the Platonists, Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, obviously things like this. The bioi, right, where we get the word biography. Who is this person in which is the teacher and is our master in whom we will follow? And so he does us this great service, but just to cut to the chase, he thinks we're a really terrible philosophy because he's a good Roman. And he thinks that we have all sorts of deficiencies that the other philosophies don't, including the one he thinks superior to all, which he argues we don't need to get into. But this starts to get at the crux of the matter, that whether he disagreed with us or not, the Romans and other pagans start to see us as a way of life substantially different enough that sort of to look at how the Christians live was synonymous to ask, what is it that they believed? And one more time, I ask us, would we be capable of being similarly mistaken? It's obviously the case that you can go look at our catechism, or that you can go find apologetics, which are good and necessary online. But how many people who are not Christian would accuse us of being a philosophy, a way of life, distinct from all others? Now, the book by Wilken goes on to talk about all sorts of very important critics, people like Celsus and Porphyry and Julian the Apostate, And they really do get into disagreements about doctrine and what doctrines of the Christians they find problematic. Many among them, the incarnation, questions that would eventually be solved by how we talk about the Trinity, creation ex nihilo, but then of course to throw back to what Bud was saying, obviously the resurrection itself being sort of in the heart of what they find problematic. Porphyry goes through and really becomes one of the first biblical critics that the Christians have to respond to answer difficulties in the Bible. You get people talking about how Jesus is a good teacher, but it's his followers that corrupt his message. The big idea being what I said about piety, like the long-lasting traditions being the fabric of a social tradition. The Christians more than willing to tear this up to start something new. But the question that I really want to bring up to is what you start to see in Wilkins' book is the Christians understand the challenge of their critics. And even though they bitterly fight them, they start to realize the blessings that their critics are. That critics are what we have to respond to and make us stronger. And that it's that very notion that in some ways perplexes the Romans, who really see religion as a sort of glue that holds things together. And so finally, my question to end this before we throw over to the questions in general is, do we match the claims that the first pagans had against our forefathers? Are we sufficiently disruptive enough that they would think about suppressing us? Are we sufficiently impious enough to the things that we should be impious about the dominant culture that they would think us different, superstitious, and strange? Do we live a life synonymous with our thoughts enough that they would accuse us of being a rival philosophy? And finally, do we believe in the truth of our faith enough that in our life we would welcome critics so that we could fine-tune the life and truth that we say that we live? Well, folks, I hope your ears aren't bleeding too loud. I know that I can get excited at the end of my talks. So thank you all for listening. That was my segment from the Resurrection and the Life, the joint series, a lecture series that Bud and I got to give virtually on April 25th, thanks to Iowa Catholic Radio and the Diocese of Des Moines. One more time, thank you to John Wynn and the Bishop for joining together for us to do that. So yeah, Bud, a wonderful evening to get to like I said, team up and talk with you again. I really do hope that people can see the Easter season as something that's not done with Easter, but really sets up the rest of our life together.
Yeah, I think it ended up being really a timely topic, and it's tough to believe, but we're staring down Pentecost here pretty soon. And I've been praying that these unique circumstances we're passing through will be an opportunity for the church to witness to the hope that we have in Christ. And I really think your piece, and hopefully my piece, a little bit captured that well, Bo.
Well, folks, it's an honor and a privilege to give that talk, and we're glad we get to share it here on Iowa Catholic Radio as well. This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our families, city, state, nation, world, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.